Tonight, as you ease yourself into rest, allow your breathing to slow, your shoulders to loosen, and your mind to drift into a gentle world where warm lamps glow, marble floors echo softly, and a quiet mansion holds a story waiting to be told. This is the tale of a man who carried the weight of two worlds, one made of power, success, and perfection, and another made of loneliness and of a child who longed for something that money could never bring into her life. And it all begins inside a grand estate where silence itself felt like another resident. Imagine a vast mansion standing at the edge of a peaceful countryside, its tall windows catching the last hues of the setting sun. This mansion belonged to Elias Munro, a man who built his fortune from the ground up, brick by brick, deal by deal, until he became one of the most influential names in the global tech world. But wealth, as he would often whisper to himself, was a silent companion. It filled rooms, but not hearts. It created echoes, but not warmth. Still, the world saw him as a man who had everything, every luxury, every resource, every door open before him. If one stepped closer, truly closer, they would realize that the only real light in Elias' life was his little daughter, Amara, a bright-eyed, curly-haired girl with a stubborn bravery and a softness that reminded Elias of the woman he had once loved and lost far too early. Since her mother's passing, Amara had been the center of Elias's universe. The one person who reminded him of who he was before the world crowned him a billionaire. But even love, pure as it was, could struggle in a house where grief had once lived so loudly. On this particular night, preparations were underway for one of Elias's rare formal gatherings, a charity gala hosted in his home. The staff moved quietly through the halls, arranging silver trays and floral displays, placing candles in elegant crystal holders, and adjusting velvet drapes that framed the staircase like a royal curtain. Yet beneath all this glamorous preparation, something else lingered: worry. Because while Elias could command companies, make historic deals, and sway the world with his quiet confidence, there was one thing he struggled deeply with: childcare, especially on nights like this. Amara had never liked parties. She disliked the noise, the strangers, the questions, the way adults bent down to her with smiles that never reached their eyes. She preferred stories, drawing, and the quiet moments when Elias read to her at night, even when he was tired. But tonight, Elias needed to host a crowd of important guests, investors, and charity board members. There was no avoiding it. And he had hoped just this one Samara might feel comfortable with someone new. Which is why, on this calm evening, a young woman named Claire Harwood arrived at the front steps of his mansion. Claire was not like the women who usually worked in houses like this. She didn't come from wealth, didn't carry polished perfection or practiced elegance. What she had instead was gentleness, a warm, quiet presence that filled the space around her like sunlight settling softly on a window. She wore simple clothes, carried a slightly old leather bag, and her hair was pinned back neatly, though a few strands refused to stay in place. She noticed the polished banisters, the framed paintings, the distant chandelier shimmering like a star suspended in the ceiling. But most of all, she noticed the silence. "Mr. Monroe will be with you in a moment," the butler said, his steps soft on the marble floor. "Thank you," Claire replied softly, adjusting the strap of her bag. She stood quietly, her heartbeat steady, her breath calm. She had learned long ago that children could sense the energy adults carried: nervousness, impatience, pride. Claire made sure to carry none of it. Moments later, Elias appeared at the top of the staircase. Tall, composed, and sharply dressed, he gave the immediate impression of a man who lived life with precision. Yet tonight, behind his composed expression, Claire sensed something else: a quiet tension, the kind that comes from balancing responsibility and fatherhood in a single breath. "Miss Harwood," he greeted, descending the stairs. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "It's no trouble, Mr. Monroe," she replied. "I'm glad to help." He nodded, grateful. "My daughter Amara is upstairs in her playroom. She's shy with new people. I hope she won't be too difficult this evening." Claire smiled gently. "Children are rarely difficult, Mr. Monroe. They're just misunderstood." Elias blinked, surprised by her words. Few people ever said things that made him pause, but before he could reply, a small voice echoed from the hallway: "Daddy." Amara stood there, small, curious, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit in her arms. Her curls framed her face like a halo of soft shadows. Her eyes, wide and thoughtful, studied Claire with a seriousness far beyond her age. Elias crouched beside his daughter. "Amara, sweetheart, this is Claire. She'll stay with you tonight while I host the event downstairs." Amara didn't reply. She just stared, her tiny fingers tightening around her plush toy. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shyness. Exactly. It was something deeper: trust, preserved carefully, given rarely. Claire lowered herself to Amara's height, her movements slow and gentle. "Hi, Amara," she said softly. "I'm happy to play with you tonight, but only if you want to." The child blinked, not pushed, not told, just offered. And for the first time that day, Amara's shoulders softened. She reached out one small hand, touching the soft fabric of Claire's sleeve, as if testing whether this person was real or just another adult who would disappear tomorrow. Claire didn't move. She simply smiled. And Amara whispered, barely above a breath.
Okay.
Something unspoken passed between them, like a quiet agreement made by souls rather than words. Elias exhaled, almost in relief. He had watched countless nannies try to win Amara's trust with toys, jokes, confidence. None of it had worked. But Claire had done it with silence, with presence, with gentleness. He didn't know yet that tonight would change his life. He didn't know that Amara's heart had felt something familiar in Claire, a feeling she hadn't felt since her mother's arms held her at night. And he certainly didn't know that before the evening ended, his daughter would ask a question so simple, so innocent, and yet so world-shifting. "Daddy, can she stay forever?" But that part of the story comes later. For now, the mansion grew quieter, the candles flickered softly, and as the evening began, 3 lives, one of power, one of innocence, and one of kindness, took their first step toward a future none of them had expected. As the evening drifted toward nightfall, the grand mansion seemed to change its breath. The chatter of arriving guests softened into a distant hum, and the glow from the chandeliers took on a warmer, dreamlike hue like candlelight wrapped in silk. Music, gentle as the rustling of velvet curtains, floated through the wide marbled corridors, creating an illusion of timelessness. It was within this serene lull that the billionaire Daniel Hartley stood quietly near the entrance hall watching his daughter, Ava, and the newly hired nanny, Clara, from a distance. Daniel had expected the party to be nothing more than a necessary performance, another evening where wealth had to sparkle, where status had to be displayed, and where cold politeness masked the exhaustion of carrying an empire alone. But tonight felt different. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the softness in Ava's laughter, a sound he had not heard in weeks. Or maybe it was the calm, steady presence of Clarissa, kind of presence that didn't force itself into a room but somehow made every corner gentler. Clara wasn't like the nannies he had interviewed before. She didn't look impressed by luxury. She didn't walk on eggshells or behave like someone stepping inside royalty. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to caring, to noticing, to listening, to understanding. And though she tried to remain in the background, Ava seemed magnetically drawn to her, as though the child had finally found an anchor she never knew she needed. The night unfolded softly. Guests greeted Daniel, complimented his home, praised his success, whispered admiration behind carefully trained smiles. Yet, even amidst the social glow, Daniel's attention drifted repeatedly toward the staircase landing where Clara knelt at Ava's height, patiently teaching her how to hold her small stuffed toy without dragging it across the floor. The tenderness of the moment felt strangely grounding, like a memory of something simpler, something human. Eventually, the crowd began to settle in the dining hall. Laughter rose like warm steam, glasses clinked softly, and the peaceful rhythm of the evening settled like snow. That was when Ava tugged at Clara's sleeve, a Ganon action so small, so pure, that Daniel found himself turning without meaning to. "Miss Clara," Ava whispered, unable to pronounce the word nanny yet. "Can you sit next to me? Please, I don't like big tables alone." Clara smiled, the kind of smile that soothed rather than glittered. "Of course," she whispered softly, "only if your daddy agrees." When Ava ran to ask Daniel, she didn't walk, she floated. Her joy illuminated her small frame, and Daniel's heart softened instantly. He nodded, gently brushing a curl from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," he murmured. "If it makes you comfortable, she can sit with you." Ava squealed softly, her voice echoing up the marble staircase like a bell. Clara followed behind her, poised, respectful, and trying not to seem as moved as she truly was. But there was something in her eyes, a tiny flicker of disbelief, as if she wasn't used to being included in rooms like this. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. The dinner began with muted murmurs and warm lighting, each guest wrapped in the comfort of the atmosphere. It was the kind of night where conversation drifted lazily, like leaves carried by a slow river. Daniel sat at the head of the table, but his gaze kept shifting toward Ava and Clara, seated a few chairs away. Ava leaned comfortably against Clara's arm, whispering questions only children would ask. And Clara answered with a gentle patience that made Ava feel safe enough to nibble her food instead of playing with it. Throughout the meal, the mansion felt different. Softer, not like a monument built from fortune, but like a home, something Daniel hadn't felt in a long time. When dessert was served, Ava dropped her spoon, startled by the noise of a sudden burst of laughter from the far end of the table. Instinctively, Clara placed a protective hand over the little girl's shoulder. Ava relaxed instantly. Daniel saw the instinct, the reflex, the genuine care in Clara's gesture, and something deep inside him shifted. Not romantically, not yet, but gently, like the first thaw of winter. As the night grew later, guests began to leave in graceful waves. Daniel walked each of them to the door, accepted their goodbyes, and exchanged the appropriate formalities. But his heart was no longer anchored to business. It was anchored to the sight behind him, Ava, leaning sleepily against Clara, her tiny hand wrapped around Clara's finger. When the last guest stepped out into the night, silence fell over the mansion once more, a peaceful silence, warm and full. Ava's eyelids fluttered heavily, her voice small and drifting. "Daddy, can she stay forever?" Daniel froze, not in shock, but in the realization of how much weight those small words carried. Clara looked startled, her hands instinctively tightening around Ava, as if uncertain whether to pull away or hold closer. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel gently raised a hand. "It's all right," he whispered softly. "She's just tired." But even as he said it, he knew the truth beneath her innocent request. Ava didn't ask for toys. She didn't ask for dresses or parties or the luxuries she grew up surrounded by. All she wanted was someone who made her feel seen, someone who listened, someone who stayed. Daniel approached them slowly. Clara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of humility and concerns, though she feared overstepping a boundary she didn't even understand yet. "You were wonderful with her tonight," Daniel said gently. "More than you know." Clara's cheeks warmed with a shy color. "I just did my job, sir." "No," he whispered, with a softness that surprised even him. "You did more than that." Ava mumbled sleepily against Clara's shoulder, clutching her stuffed toy as though the world outside didn't matter. Clara adjusted her hold carefully, not possessive, not hesitant, just caring. Daniel watched the two of them, a quiet ache blooming behind his ribcage. For the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't measured, calculated, or expected. It wasn't tied to wealth or reputation. It wasn't something the world could buy. It was simply warmth. The little girl, now wrapped in a blanket patterned with silver moons, rested her head against the nanny's shoulder. But for as long as she needs you, the room felt as though it held its breath. The nanny looked at the small sleeping child, then back at him. "I'll stay," she murmured softly, "as long as she wants me to." And in that still, gentle moment, the house once echoing with emptiness felt like a home finally exhaling.